Hey class, and welcome back. So this lecture we're going to go over how we listen. This is going to be over chapter 2 and also chapter 3 here in a little bit. We're also going to go over EQ. So please make sure you've already read over chapter 2 and chapter 3 before going over this. We're just going to touch on the good parts. Cool, so first let's talk about transducers. Transducers are a device that converts energy from one form to another. So when we're talking about, getting audio from, say, the source, my snap, to your ear, there's going to be a transduction of energy because, of course, that snap is, the actual mechanical energy of me creating the snap. There's the actual acoustic energy of the molecules vibrating off of that mechanical energy that was created. And then that's going to effectively propagate as an acoustic wave, like we talked about last week, acoustic waves. And then that's going to make its way to, say, a microphone, where that acoustic energy is going to be converted to electrical energy. Then that microphone is going to make its way to a preamp, where we'll increase its amplitude. And then it'll make its way to maybe a converter box, which will convert it to digital, which is a digital energy. We'll go over each of these different types of energies here in a little bit, but I just want you to know that a transducer is used to convert energy from one form to another. So for an example, a microphone would convert acoustic energy to electrical, and a speaker would convert that electrical via mechanical energy back to acoustical energy. Let's talk about the different forms of energy. So we've got acoustical energy, that's just molecules vibrating within a pressurized system. We've got mechanical energy, that's where something is physically moving, like a speaker, moving back and forth, causing vibrations. That's going to cause acoustic energy, but of course that mechanical energy is a form of energy in and of itself. Electrical energy, that's electrons, flying through our signal chain, whether it be through, most of the time through just a simple cable. And then we've also got digital energy. That's where we convert that electrical energy to zeros and ones, where it can be converted back to electrical energy, which can then be converted to mechanical energy, which can then be converted to acoustic energy, which then our ear can actually use to convert back to electrical energy that our brain can perceive. So speaking of ears, let's talk about how our ears work as transducers, which is neat that we actually physically have a transducer of our own to convert acoustic energy to something that our brain can recognize. So humans can hear, like we talked about last week, 20 to 20,000 cycles per second. So that's frequency again. So as long as that frequency is between 20 cycles per second, 20,000 cycles per second, as humans, if you haven't lost any of your hearing, you should be able to hear that. There's three sections of the ear that includes your outer, your middle, and your inner. They each do different things. So your outer ear is going to be used to direct the sound into the canal. So, as you can imagine, our ear is that shape so that it allows that acoustical energy to actually kind of form down and make its way into that canal. Once in the canal, that's the middle ear. That's the eardrum and bones that are going to vibrate, amplifying sound and converting it to mechanical energy. Then within the inner ear, we've got fluid that moves around the inner ear, causing little hairs to kind of vibrate, which then send that electrical signal impulses to your brain, which is ultimately how you're able to hear, how you're able to communicate. So let's watch a quick video on that. It just kind of makes all of that kind of make more sense with visual. So let's check that out.
Ears are constantly active. They pick up sound waves and change them into information that the brain can interpret, such as music or speech. Sound is a pressure wave that can vibrate either quickly or slowly. Slow vibrations produce deep sounds, while quick vibrations produce high-pitched sounds. Sound enters the ear and is directed through the ear canal, where it first reaches the eardrum. As the eardrum begins to vibrate, it sets the ossicular chain in motion. The ossicular chain consists of the hammer, anvil, and the stirrup. Sound vibrations move along the ossicular chain and into the inner ear. Within the inner ear, the cochlea plays a central role. It is here that the mechanical energy of sound is converted into complex electrical signals, which are then passed on to the brain. In simplified terms, the cochlea is a spiral-shaped tube filled with fluid. Sensory cells, also called hair cells, line the entire length of the cochlea. These hair cells have varying degrees of sensitivity for the detection of different tones or frequencies. This allows the ear to perceive the entire spectrum of sound. The change from mechanical vibration to electrical pulse is a complex process resulting from the movement of hair cells in the cochlea. Along the entire length of the cochlea, the hair cells are arranged like the keys of a piano. Hair cells located at the base or lower region of the cochlea are responsible for high frequency, while hair cells at the apex are responsible for the low frequencies. As the fluid in the cochlea is set in motion, it causes a corresponding movement of the fine structures on the surface of the hair cells to take place. These movements cause tension differences which produce electrical signals that are passed along the hearing nerve to the brain. The auditory cortex of the brain interprets this information as sound, for example as music or speech. The entire chain of events, including the various steps that convert sound waves from the environment into information that the brain can interpret, happens so fast that individuals can hear sound both continuously and instantaneously. Within this complex chain of events, there are a number of factors which can cause an individual to experience hearing loss. A loss of hearing can range from a mild to moderate hearing deficiency to a total hearing loss. In general, there are three main types of hearing loss which differ from one another depending on the part of the ear that is affected, be it the outer, middle, or inner ear.
Cool. Awesome. Cool. So I hope that just kind of clarified a few things, just kind of visuals are nice, but the big thing there, if you notice that cochlea, the big spiral shaped guy there, you notice that the high frequencies are right there at the opening. So that's why usually adults will start to lose their high end starting, with the top end on the way down. It's not very often you'll lose your low end first. That there is cases of that, but most often you're going to start losing your top end first, and it's because it's just right there at the opening of that guy. But also, if you work at like a factory or something, and you're getting always the same sounds over and over again, like constant frequencies, especially at loud amplitudes, you can sometimes actually kind of tear away pieces in the middle, causing whole dips in your hearing. So of course, we just want to be careful with our hearing, and of course, always be using protection if you can. So let's break this down a little bit. We talked about last week frequency ranges. So let's break those down again. These are sometimes referred to as bands. We've got lows, mids, and highs. So our lows are going to be 20 to 200 cycles per second, or hertz. Those are usually classified as big, warm, omnidirectional, powerful. We've also got our mids. Those are anywhere from 200 hertz to 5 kilohertz. Those are very kind of in your face. Like I talked about last week, those are the ones that are actually going to vibrate the bones within your chest and head and body. And so they actually feel that way because they're actually vibrating those pieces. And then we've also got our highs. Those are 5 kilohertz and above. Those are usually classified as bright, thin, very directional. And one thing about the ear that we talked about is that the ear actually has a resonant frequency of about 3 kilohertz. So humans are actually more sensitive to mids than they are to highs and to lows. So let's talk about the FletcherMunson curve. FletcherMunson curve is pretty cool. It's actually how we're able to tell how loud we should be listening to something in order for it to kind of our highs, mids, and lows to kind of equal out in volume. Where we talked about we're more sensitive to mids, so at low volumes, our mids seem louder than our lows and our highs. So they figured out, Fletcher and Munson, a couple folks, were able to figure out by putting headphones on some people and doing some tests that about 85 decibels, it starts to flatten out, where if you give the same amount of decibel of a low frequency, a mid frequency, and a high frequency, that those are going to kind of be perceptually around the same volume. So let's kind of break that down. The first, what they called the equal loudness contour experiment by Harvey Fletcher and Walden A. Munson was in 1933. And they found out that as actual loudness changes, the perceived loudness our brains hear will change at different rates depending on frequency. So at low volumes, mids are going to seem more prominent, while lows and highs seem to fall into the background. And then at high volumes, above that 80 to 85 decibels, lows and highs actually start to be more prominent, while mids seem to be comparatively softer. So let's take a look at that curve. So here we have in red the original FletcherMunson curve, and then of course they've recreated it over and over and over again throughout the years, and they pretty much keep coming to about the same conclusion. Not 100%, but they find that this starts to flatten out best at about the 85 decibels. So as a representation here, we're seeing that at low volumes, mids can actually sound the same as lows at high volumes. So that's, not good to listen to your music at low volumes unless you just want lots of mids to be present. So as you start to turn the music up, you'll start to see that the curve starts to flatten out a little bit. And about the 80 is about where it flattens out the most. That's where our equal loudness contours, what we call it. So our highs, mids, and our lows will be equal in volume with the same amount of amplitude. Cool. So again, we talked about we achieved the level of optimal listening by using the FletcherMunson curve. So that came out to about 80 to 85 decibels, because according to the FletcherMunson curve, most humans will hear frequency ranges equally at that volume. And also one more thing to know about our ears that they were able to figure out with this FletcherMunson curve is that our ears will actually start to limit at about 95 decibels. So it'll start to you start to hear little distortions that you're getting within your own ear because he's trying to lower that volume to protect your inside. So that will actually cause your lows to become flatter in pitch. So actually your lows will change in pitch and your highs will become sharper in pitch. So that's also a good reason to not ever have, your monitors too loud when you're performing or even your headphones too loud when you're recording. Because otherwise you might sing a little off pitch because you might be trying to sing along to a song that your ears are putting out of key, pretty much. Cool, earplugs. So we got to talk about protection. You got to protect your ears. You're only given 2 of them, and there are surgeries to help some folks, and there are hearing aids that can help other folks. But we want to do the best to keep our ears as protected as possible, so that we can, maintain our enjoyment, listening enjoyment. So there are some options out there. They have molds that you can get with attenuators built in. Those usually you have to go to an audiologist to get. They can be kind of expensive because you gotta pay for an audiologist, but they're about $100 to $200 depending. Then they've got the Heroes. These things are only about $17. They're gonna lower the volume at about 17 decibels or so. So it's really good for practices, loud performances, things of that nature. What's cool about the Heroes is they're actually going to lower the volume equally across the frequency spectrum. So it's just going to lower the volume. If you've ever used those yellow molds or something like that, those guys are those little foam earplugs. You see this little chart here. They don't lower the volume very flat. A lot of times, anytime I ever use them in a practice space, all I hear is like the snare drum. It's not good. So I recommend getting something a little nicer. Heroes, like I said, you can pick those up for about $15 to $17. Erasers are a little nicer. These, I've had the molds before. I currently use the erasers because to me they feel the most like the molds. They actually look just like the molds. They feel like they're made out of the same material. Just they're not specifically molded to my ear, but they seem to work out really well. Those are around the $39 mark. And they've also got the dubs. Those are like the Heroes. I like the Heroes a little more, but some people like the dubs. In fact, my wife really likes the dubs. Just she thinks they're a little more comfortable. But again, any sort of ear protection, the better. And if you can do it while still maintaining, where it still sounds good, it just means you're probably going to use them more often, especially for practices or gigs and stuff. I actually have my erasers. I always keep on my keychain, so just kind of always keep them handy. Talk about OSHA standards. So these are the folks that set the standards for maintaining job safety. So what they've done is they figured out how long you can be in an environment or loud environment safely without having to worry about hearing damage. So they found that about at 80 decibels, 90 decibels, you can be at about 90 decibels for about 8 hours. So that's a full work day at about 90 decibels without having to worry too much about something going wrong. And that's why I typically, whenever I'm mixing my music for the audience, I'll try to stick somewhere between 90 to 95 decibels, just so that I don't have to worry about my crowd having damage every night they go home from one of my shows. Obviously, it's better if they have protection, just in case something does get louder, or there's a horn part that's not even coming through my mix, but they're standing right in front of the player or something. So it's always good again to have earplugs. But it's something to know that about 95 decibels, you can spend 8 hours in that environment. But it starts to go very quickly over that 90 decibel mark. So at 92 decibels, we can only get about 6 hours of good time. 95 decibels, about 4 hours. 97 decibels, about 3 hours. Once we get up to that 100 decibel mark, about 2 hours, we're going to start seeing damage. 2.5 or 1.5 decibels, about 1.5 hours. 102 decibels, 1.5 hours. 105 decibels, 1 hour. 110 decibels for about a half hour. So there's some stages that they mix 110 decibels up there for that performer, and at about a half hour they're getting damaged. So anytime I'm performing, I'll usually have earplugs in. And then quarter hour less, 15 minutes or so at about this 115. And we talked about last week, the threshold of pain is about 120 decibels. So definitely want to keep your mixes at a much lower volume, and of course maintain protection if you are going to have to be in an environment that's this loud. Cool. So let's talk about acoustic energy for a little bit. Anytime there's an acoustic environment, say I'm snapping an environment, if y'all were in this room with me from this snap, if you were to hear that snap from me to you, it would actually be what we call direct sound. So the sound from source to listener, or let's just say I'm the listener and this is the source. When I snap, it's going to travel from my hand to my ear. And that's direct sound. So that's just the vibration from here to here as our direct sound. Well, however, we talked about how sound propagates all around. And then, so what we found is that as it propagates out, we get more than just the direct sound. We also start to get what we call early reflections. That's where, say like whenever I snap, it's going to make its way, it's going to bounce off of my table, it's going to bounce off of my screen, it's going to bounce off maybe the floor, maybe get some bounces off of the roof, and they're all going to come down and effectively hit my ear at a slower time. It's going to take more time than the direct sound, obviously, because direct sound straight from source to listener. Early reflections are going to bounce off of the first piece, and then they're going to allow the listener to hear those. And then we've got reverberation, which is going to be every other little piece that bounces around the room and then hits my ear. So that's our reverberation. So in most small rooms, all of this takes place in a very short amount of time. This one snap is, we're talking an order of, less than half a second, probably even quicker than that. So all this stuff happens very quickly, but it's just good to know that we have sound coming in 3 different successively occurring categories. So let's talk about this a little more. Direct sound, again, that's the quickest path to the listener. So just source to listener, direct path. And it helps, the idea there is that you're able to, as a human, tell the direction that the source is coming from with that direct sound. So if someone's snapping over here, I can perceive it as over here. If someone's snapping over here, I perceive it as over here. So that's direct sound. That's what we, as humans, use that direct sound for, to tell direction. Early reflections. Remember, again, these are the things that are going to bounce off the first thing, kind of like in this picture here, we're going to see things bounce off the ceiling, bounce off of the floor, maybe bounce off a wall. If there was a table in here, they bounce off of that. So that's our early reflections. They occur immediately after the direct sound, and those help cue us into the surface types. So those help us, in a room that's wood, it's going to sound like a room that's full of wood. If it's a room that's full of glass or full of concrete or just different materials, it's going to sound different. So one cool thing about early reflection is they were able to find, they found out the Haas effect. The Haas effect is pretty neat. It's this cool effect that our brain has a difficult time interpreting early reflections under about 20 milliseconds. So it's pretty neat that we can actually take advantage of that by delaying if we have like a reverb and we delay our reverb from starting until about 20 milliseconds after the initial source, we can make it sound more realistic, because it's going to sound, if our reverb channel started at the same time as our direct sound, it would sound like I was speaking directly into a wall. That's not very natural. It's not very often we're speaking directly into a wall where our direct sound and early reflections happen at the same time. So we can put about a 20 millisecond delay in there between when our reverb actually kicks in and our direct sound, and it doesn't sound like a delay. It just sounds like a thickening agent, which is pretty neat. So we were able to figure out that if you set your pre-delay to about 20 milliseconds, there won't be any real noticeable change, but it'll start to sound more realistic because we're getting that more direct sound before we start getting those early reflections and reverberations. Speaking of reverberation, reverberation is actually what's left over, and it helps determine the size of a space where a sound originates. So it's the wash left after the initial sound and early reflections. So the longer it takes for a wash to go away, the larger the space or the environment. You can imagine in my room here, whenever I snap, very quick. However, if I was on a very large stage or at an orchestra, something, or a place where an orchestra would play, maybe Coliseum or something, those reverb times are going to be much longer. In an arena, it can be, 2 seconds to 3 seconds, maybe even. You can clap on that stage and you'll still hear that clap bouncing off of, the back walls moments later. So that's fun. So just to know that sound happens in 3 successively occurring categories of sound, especially in an acoustic space. And of course, we can recreate that with our electrical space, but we'll get into that when we start talking about effects. Cool. So let's start talking about selective hearing. So selective hearing is what we as audio engineers use to focus on individual components of a sound, the different frequency ranges, and the overall sound. So in the book, they actually talk about some really cool ways of allowing you to expand upon this. So one cool thing they talk about is the 3D ball. So whenever I'm listening to a song, if I use the 3D ball to imagine how that mix engineer created the sound, I can kind of start to fill in the ball. I can kind of start to see, did the mix engineer make that ball sound full, or does it sound like a flat ball? So a nice full ball is going to be kind of more the kind of mix that we're usually shooting for, something that's got some full range. It's got lots of things going on. So let's break that down a little bit. So the 3D ball, let's think of our 3D ball. We've got left and right. So let's think of that as our panning. That's where, as an audio engineer, we can pan to the left or to the right. So we'll take that mono channel and I can either put it all the way to the left or all the way to the right. So there could be certain things in a mix where I have the hi-hat pan to one side and I've got a floor tom pan to the other side to make the drum sound bigger and fuller. It could be that I've got a piano part that I've got one mic covering this side of the piano. I've got another mic covering this side of the piano, and I want this one to only come out the left side, this one to only come out the right side, give that kind of stereo feel. So that's the left and right of the 3D ball. If we were to think of the front and back of the 3D ball, we can think of volume. So if something is closer, it's going to be louder. If something is further away, it's going to be quieter. So you can kind of think of that in the 3D ball. Does it sound like they put the lead singer in the front, or does it sound like they put the lead singer in the back? Obviously, most of the time it sounds like they put the lead singer in the front. Then you could go listen to a Strokes album, it sounds like they threw him in the back. So as a 3D ball, we can listen to a song and feel where did they put them in that spectrum. Next thing we can talk about is the up and down. That's our EQ. So we can think of highs, mids, lows. So you can kind of think of it as, highs we talked about. Those are things that sound like they're vibrating above your head, like sounds like flies flying around, bacon sizzling, it's high frequency stuff. We got mids we talked about. Those kind of start to vibrate in your face and in your jaw and your chest and make its way down kind of into your gut. And then we can talk about low end where, it actually literally just going to shake your booty. So that's a full range ball, and you can kind of imagine, how did they fill the ball all the way to the top, to the sides, front and back? Or does it sound very flat and everything's just pushed to the front, everything's as loud as it can possibly be? Or is there some dynamic there and the ball seems like it's got some depth? So it's just something to consider. And then, of course, reverb, that's just, did they fill in the ball, or does it sound like a dry ball? Is it wet or dry? Then we can also talk about in the another thing as mix engineers, you kind of want to think about the frequency pyramid. Does it sound like everything is just pushed to one side or the other? Does it sound like everything is just coming straight down the middle? With a frequency pyramid, they kind of talk about how you want to set your foundation. You got your low end, your bass, all that fun stuff. It can kind of sit, just kind of right in the center. And then we can start to put maybe higher frequency stuff can kind of start making its way to the sides and things of that nature and all the way to the top. You just want to make sure you're balancing those frequencies. Next thing is the mix wet or dry. So when we talk about wet versus dry, wet usually refers to that the mix has a lot of effects. They're putting a lot of reverb, maybe some delays, maybe some chorus. Just does it sound like they put a lot of effects, or does it sound more like a dry mix? Something that it sounds very natural. Cool. So we already talked about the different tools to manipulate the 3D ball, but just to kind of go over them again. We talked about panning, then that's just left and right in the stereo field. Volume, that's moving towards or away from the listener. EQ, that's the up and down reference, highs, mids, lows. And then of course reverb, does it sound like they create an environment? Cool. So now we've kind of talked about the 3D ball, the frequency pyramid, and whether a mix is wet or dry. I want to talk about our first assignment. So this is analyzing a music recording from page 24 in our chapter. So let's take a look at it real quick. And here, it actually, the assignment is these, we've got 7 questions there. So take a look over that. I'll kind of read them here to you, but obviously if you have the book, it's going to be just right there for you. But what I want you to do is read these 7 questions. I want you to answer these questions in a paragraph format. And I want you to ultimately email me back the paragraph with a workable link so I can hear the song that you listen to. But what I want you to do is listen to a song, analyze it, and see if you can answer these questions about that song. So let's number 1, listen to a song and identify all the instruments and sounds in the mix. Number 2, where are all the sounds placed in the 3D reference ball? Which sounds appear in the center? Which sounds appear on the sides? Do any instruments have a stereo spread? Number 3, how do the vocals sit in the mix? Are they in the front of the ball, or do they blend more with the music? Number 4, what are the tones of the individual sounds? Are some sounds bright while others are dark and dull? What are the overall tones of the recording? Number 5, can you hear the environment around each sound? Do all the instruments appear to be in the same place? What does the overall environment sound like? And number 6, is it wet or dry? A wet mix will have lots of effects such as reverb, delay, or echo, and is often used in pop, psychedelic, surf, and reggae music. And a dry mix is more organic, with little to no effects appearing in the mix. Dry mixes are more common in folk, blues, jazz, classical, and bluegrass music. And finally, and most importantly, how does the recording make you feel? So take a look at that. Answer all of those questions. Listen to a song. Answer all those questions about it in paragraph format, and then send that over to me. That way, I can get you in there for graded for your listening analysis paper. So just get that to me. It will be due class 7, so you've got quite a bit of time to get that worked out. Cool. So let's move on to chapter 3, equalization. So again, just make sure you've read over that chapter before finishing the lecture. Cool. So equalization, also known as EQ, is the action of equalizing a sound or control to change the tone of the sound. The tone of an overall sound is altered by increasing or boosting or decreasing, known as cutting, the amplitude of a frequency or range of frequencies. So if something is flat, that means the frequency is neither boost or cut. So we'll talk about leaving the EQ flat, means that it just sounds natural. Or do we boost a certain frequency, or do we cut a certain frequency? That means no longer flat. Peak frequency, so whenever we're talking about changing our frequency knob, that's talking about there's a peak frequency, there's a center frequency, and it's going to affect all the frequencies around it as well, but starting with the peak. So if the frequency selector is on, let's say, 100 hertz, it's going to affect 100 the most. Q is ultimately just the range of frequencies being affected on either side of that peak. So a very high Q would be something that is effectively, Q stands for quality. So a higher Q would mean that it's a higher quality of that peak, meaning it's mostly just whatever that peak is. So a lower Q would actually start to widen out, and it's going to start getting more of the other other frequencies around the peak. And we'll go over that a little more with examples. But usually, whenever we're talking about Q, we're talking about you want to boost wide, meaning you want to have a nice wide Q. And whenever you're cutting, you want to cut small, meaning you want that Q to be small. The reason why is if we're going to remove frequencies, we usually are going to take out problematic frequencies. And most of the time, if we're boosting frequencies, we're trying to accentuate. And if we just accentuate, maybe just one frequency, like maybe go with a real high Q. If we just accentuate that one, let's imagine we're a musician and we're playing, and all of a sudden we get to one note and it's really loud. So we want to avoid that by kind of widening that out a little bit to where the notes around it sound to be about the same in volume as well. Cool. Let's go over some frequency comparisons. So most of the time, you're going to compare highs to lows, and people are going to speak about them differently. We've got a lot of examples in 33 of how to use some adjectives, but here's just some examples of some different adjectives being used to describe either low frequencies or high frequencies. So let's go over lows first. So lows, that's again anywhere from that 20 to 200 hertz. Usually those are classified as bass frequencies. Normally, if there's a lot of them and not a lot of highs, you'll call it dark. If it has a lot of these lows, we're going to think of it as big sounding or powerful or huge. However, high frequencies, it's kind of always the opposite. If you notice, there's 5 to 20 kilohertz bass or treble. We talk about treble. Effectively, treble is the high stuff. Bright. Whenever we think of a bright sound, we think of it having lots of high frequencies in it. Versus dark, meaning it feels like you've taken a lot of the high frequencies away from it. Small, we usually think of high frequencies as small because they are small. We talked about wavelength, teeny tiny, most of them. Weak because even with high amplitudes, they're not going to vibrate your wall or anything like that. And usually, again, they're teeny tiny because of, again, just smaller wavelength. So there's just different ways people have used adjectives to describe these frequencies. So EQ. So most of the time when you're EQing, there's two main forms of EQ. We've got a shelf and a peaking EQ. A shelf is actually going to impact all frequencies above or below a specific frequency. So if this was my shelf and this was my peak frequency, I'm going to affect everything above this frequency. So you see, actually, I guess this would be my peak frequency here. So anything below, if it's a low shelf, if it's a high shelf, be anything above. Alternatively, we have a peaking EQ, and that's going to impact a range of frequencies around the peak. So if our peak is, say, here in the center, we're going to affect a range of frequencies. This would be a nice wide Q. If it was, something very kind of straight up and down, we have that nice high Q. Cool. So let's talk about the four main reasons to use EQ. So we've got corrective. That's to lower unwanted frequencies, usually to make your mic sound better. We've got creative. That's when you want to do something wild to your track during mix down and make it sound completely different. Something to add contrast. Fix masking for better separation in a mix. Masking is where if two, let's say our kick drum and our bass guitar, if those are kind of encompassing the same frequencies, I can maybe boost frequencies on a kick drum that I take out of the bass and maybe boost frequencies on the bass that I take out of the kick drum, allowing them to kind of have their own space. Because if they both are actually using the same frequencies as their fundamental, they can actually what they call mask, where the kick drum will be louder than the bass guitar, even though they may both be almost the same volume. If they are the same frequency, whichever one is louder, even if it's just a little bit, you're only going to hear that one because of a term we call masking. So that's just something to watch out for. You don't want too much masking because you'll be like, I'm turning it up, but I still can't hear it. It could be because you haven't given it its own space. Blending usually allows, with the EQ, you can make things sound less harsh. You can sometimes add panning to maybe some backing vocals to kind of make the backing vocals sound different than the lead vocals to kind of make them blend better. And of course, you should always almost never apply EQ when you're recording. Of course, that's not the hard rule, but most of the time, it's best to save your EQ for when you're doing your mix down. Because if you take it away now, you can't add it later. So let's go over the different types. So we've got our graphic EQ, parametric EQ, fixed EQ, semiparametric EQ, and paragraphic EQ. Let's break that out a little bit. So we've got our graphic EQ. So graphic EQ is cool. You're going to see this a lot in live sound. The reason why is because it actually, whenever you start to move these faders up and down, it kind of creates a graph. You can see if I boost my low frequency, this is 20 hertz. If I was to boost 20 hertz, you would see it. And you'd see it on like a graph, which is pretty neat. So for live sound, these have become very popular because if there's any changes, you can see them, and you can kind of see, does your graph look kind of flat, or does it look like somebody's really just kind of gone to town on that thing? And some of them actually are pretty neat because they'll actually have little light ups with some real-time analysis telling you where your peaking problems are at. So you can just go to where you're peaking out and just lower the volume, which is pretty neat. But graphic EQ is effectively, it's non-sweepable, meaning that each of these faders are fixed. So we can go to 20 hertz. I can't select 20 hertz or any other frequency than 20 hertz with this fader. If I wanted to select another frequency, I would just go to another fader. So if I wanted 125, I could affect the amplitude of 125 by either boosting the fader or cutting the fader. And of course, there's just sliders or faders on these bad boys. So they're pretty cool. It's just an easy way of seeing what your graph looks like. And again, it's non-sweepable, but you got multiple faders here. Those come in most of the time 31 band EQ. There's also 15 band. I've seen smaller. I've seen bigger. Parametric. So parametric is neat. Parametric has a sweepable frequency, meaning I can go to my frequency knob. Let's find it here. And I can adjust it. So I can go from 40 hertz to 50 hertz to 100 hertz, 200 hertz, 400 hertz. Whatever frequency I want to adjust, I select it on my frequency knob. And of course, the amplitude is also adjustable. So then I would go to my amplitude, and I would, if I want to boost, I could flip to boost. If I want to cut, flip to cut. And then I add gain. So I would either, if I flip this, I would add 10 decibels. If this was in boost mode, I could add 10 decibels. Or if it was in cut mode, I could take away 10 decibels. So it has an adjustable amplitude with a sweepable frequency. That's the big deal about parametric. Sweepable frequency, adjustable amplitude. And here's the next kicker. It has an adjustable Q. So we talked about that, where we can either go high Q, where it's just affecting the peak frequency, or we can go wide Q, where it's going to affect a range of frequencies around it. So again, that would be something like here, where here it says sharp to broad. So sharp would be high Q, broad would be a wide Q. Fixed EQs. Fixed EQs are cool, but I'm not as much of a fan of these. You're going to see these on, kind of inexpensive consoles. They're fun, but effectively here we've got a knob that allows us to either boost or cut the amplitude of a selected frequency. And it's non-sweepable. So effectively, with the 3-knob EQ, we've only got 3 EQ choices. So I can either boost or cut 80 hertz, booster cut 2.5 kilohertz, or booster cut 12 kilohertz. So, these are neat, but they're just kind of limited in what you can do. But on most, inexpensive systems, it's just a quick, simple way of maybe adding a little extra mids to your vocal, or maybe adding a little extra low into your kick, or maybe getting rid of some mids of your bass drum or bass guitar or something. So these are neat. Semiparametric. So semiparametric is a lot like parametric, only it doesn't have a Q. That's the only difference. So it's still sweepable, so we still have a frequency that can be selected. We don't have a Q though, so there's no way of changing it. However, and most of the time it's on knobs. So in here, we talked about a peak versus a shelf. So here, this particular EQ example has a high shelf and a low shelf, and it has a high mid peak and a low mid peak. So that's kind of neat. So that means that whenever I'm selecting a frequency on this guy, he's associated with my low shelf. So if I'm here at 80 hertz and I boost, I'm going to boost 80 hertz and everything below 80 hertz. If I come here to 12K on this one and I boost, on with this knob, I'm going to boost 12 kilohertz and everything above 12 kilohertz. If I cut, I'm going to cut 12 kilohertz and everything below, or and cut 12 kilohertz and everything above kilohertz. Start that over again. If I was to turn this knob to 12 kilohertz and turn this knob up, I would be boosting 12 kilohertz and every frequency above it. And if I was to lower it, I would be lowering 12 kilohertz and every frequency above it. Just as an example on our peaking, if I was to say pick 1 kilohertz and I was to boost 1 kilohertz, I'm going to boost 1 kilohertz and the range of frequencies around 1 kilohertz, not just above or below, but around. Whenever I'm on a low shelf, it's everything below, high shelf, everything above, on a peak, everything around. Cool. Paragraphic. So paragraphic is cool. It's a lot like, it's kind of actually a combo of the parametric, which is actually still here, so you still get a parametric, but it adds the graphic. So you're only going to find these within like digital consoles or within your recording software. You're not really going to find these on an analog piece of gear, but they're still really neat. What I like about them is that you can still come in and you can boost or cut. You can select if you want it to be a peak or a shelf. You can adjust your Q. You can sweep your frequency. And this particular example has 5 bands that we can play with. So it's pretty neat. Again, paragraphic, usually digital. It has an adjustable Q, but it's a parametric with a visual aid. Cool. Let's talk a little bit about filters. Filters are a little different than a typical EQ band. A lot of times you'll find them on EQs. In fact, this particular guy here has a high pass filter and a low pass filter. But what a filter does is ultimately used to completely eliminate the amplitude of the filtered frequencies. So I have, high or low passes, also known as effectively a a high cut. A low pass and a high cut are the same thing. A low cut and a high pass, same thing. High cut, low pass, same thing. So effectively, you can kind of see that here. A low pass is going to effectively allows the lows to pass while cutting out all of the highs. And there will be, just like over here, there's the ability to select the frequency. So I can bring that frequency. Let's see, this one here is a high pass filter. So it's allowing our highs to pass. That means we're cutting out our lows. And as you can see here, they're cutting out 12 decibels for every octave below 86 decibels. So starting at 86 decibels, this guy starts to lower the volume 12 decibels for every octave until it's down to nothing. So that's the difference between a filter, which brings it all the way down to nothing, versus an EQ, which is where even if I took this gain all the way to the bottom, he's only going to go down to about -12. So it's not going to be quite as dramatic if I'm trying to, let's say, get rid of some air conditioning noise or rumble on a microphone. If I filter it out, it's gone. If I just lower the EQ of my low frequencies, then we're just lowering that volume by about 12 decibels, which is cool, but not quite as effective. Alternatives, some other filter options. We have band pass filter. That's where we're allowing a band of frequencies to pass while cutting out everything above and below that band. This is a lot of times used for like telephone sounds. Like if you ever hear someone talking on a telephone in a movie, effectively they're just using a band pass filter to make it sound that way. Because of course we all know that that's not how phones sound anymore. And then of course we've got our band stop. Our band stop filter is going to actually cut out every frequency in the middle. So it's going to allow frequencies to either stay or low frequencies to stay, high frequencies to stay, while eliminating everything in the middle. Cool. Subtractive versus additive EQ. So this is going to be 2 different styles of EQing. We can either cut frequencies that are a problem, by doing some repair action. If we're listening to this EQ and there's a problem here, maybe it sounds muddy, we can remove this mud. However, if we were to come over and take a look at this guy, this is where they did a lot of boosting. It's going to help things stand out. The only thing about this, though, is the only picture I could find on the internet of some boosted EQ was under 6 warning signs you don't know what you're doing with EQ. And that's simply because if we take a look at this guy, there's actually subtractive EQ going on here too, because what we're effectively doing here when we're boosting is we're creating a new top line. So if we were to create this new top line here, we see that there's actually a huge scoop right here, and there's another huge scoop right here. So technically this is just a really scooped out signal at this point. It may seem like we're boosting, but really in reality, if we put that new flat line across the top and see it compared to flat, we're moving quite a bit right here. So it's just something to consider. I'm never going to call it wrong, but to boost frequencies, because you can really make certain things just really stand out and shine by doing that. But I also want you to be aware that most of the time, most engineers, when they're using EQs, we're just doing it subtractively to remove the problems and the things we don't want there. Cool, let's talk about some different EQ points of interest. So we've got our subs. Those are usually things that require a subwoofer to recreate. Those are frequencies below 80 hertz and also just known as low frequencies. Also some additional low frequencies that 20 to 200 hertz. Those are kind of big, fat kind of sounding tones there. Muddy, that term, that adjective starts to come about somewhere between that 100 to 300 hertz. It's this low to low mid frequency that most things can totally use some scooping on. You know, go a little high Q on that, sweep till you find the problem, and then just get rid of it. Boxy, hollow sounds, those are about the 300 to 700 hertz. That's your lows to low mid frequencies. Some in your face, edge, bite, crunch. That's that 1.5 to 4 kilohertz. That's some mid to upper mid frequencies. Some presence and clarity. Those start to come about the 4 to 10 kilohertz upper mid high frequency range. And then we start to get that airy bacon seasoning sounds at about that 10 kilohertz. And of course, I want y'all to kind of make sure you look over the chapter on page 33 where we talk about some different adjectives, or just using plain English to talk about sound. You know, so if somebody they wanted something to sound very bright, you know, very angelic, you know, that makes, you know, sense to some people. You kind of think of, that's probably got a lot of reverb on it. It's probably got a lot of high frequency stuff. It's, you know, maybe kind of reflective, and kind of you imagine angels singing. Then we've got beefy. You know, you kind of think of something's beefy, kind of more, it's got a lot of low end to it maybe. It sounds like it's nice and full. We talked earlier about dry versus wet. You know, dry just sounds like there's not a lot of effects on it. Boomy, it might be that it's just sounding like somebody's too close to the microphone, or there's a buildup of that low frequency. It's kind of like beefy but gone wrong. There's nasally. That's where it's this about 4 kilohertz sound that just sounds like, you know, like someone's nose effectively, and you can get that really nasally sound by boosting about 4 kilohertz. Or if you want to get rid of that nasally sound, you can remove about 4 kilohertz. Warm, we kind of talked about that before, but kind of warm we kind of think of as like, you know, like a building with lots of wood in it, kind of these warm kind of tones, where kind of more low frequency stuff than high frequency, where, you know, highs would probably be absorbed in a nice warm room, you know. And of course there's more examples on page 33. I just want y'all to take a look at that. And of course, again, I have the link to the quiz website, and also I have a link to an online frequency generator. I don't want to play with the frequency generator on the pre-recording, but I do want y'all to go ahead and hop on there if y'all want, play around with it a little bit, because everyone's ears are a little different. You can actually use it to test your hearing, because it actually is going to sweep all the way from 20 to 20,000 cycles per second, so you can see if you can actually hear all the way to the tip top. Cool. Well, thanks again. It's always a pleasure. And again, if y'all have any questions, please let me know, and I look forward to seeing y'all soon. And thanks again.